Before we begin, I would like to say a few rules to make our meeting smooth. We will have a 45 minutes of speaker session or talking about their research and work at NASA Johnson Space Center Neuroscience Division. And after that, we will have a 15 minutes of Q&A session. Please make sure to submit the questions through the Mentimeter in this QR code so that we can ask them during the Q&A sessions. I will send the link in the chat box after this. It's a pleasure today to introduce Dr. Wood from NASA Johnson Space Center today. Dr. Scott Wood is a NASA Senior Scientist and Neuroscience Laboratory Director for the Human Health and Performance Directorate at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. He serves as the Sensory Motor Discipline Lead for the Health and Countermeasures element with the Human Research Program. He's also the co-lead of Crew Health Countermeasures activity for the Mars Campaign Office, MCO, which is charged with developing technologies and countermeasures for exploration missions. He has participated in numerous flight studies and oversees the pre-post-flight dynamic postography used for medical assessment, and Dr. Wood began his research career at NASA while completing his doctorate at the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. In addition to his spaceflight research, he has conducted research in clinical and military aerospace laboratories. Dr. Wood's principal research goal is to understand the mechanisms of multisensory integration and neuroplasticity and apply this knowledge to improve rehabilitation strategies and optimize human performance. So everyone, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Wood.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, and Dr. Wood is all yours.
All right, let me send a request to share, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Did I accept your request?
I guess I'm having to enable my system. Sorry about this.
Oh, no, you're good. Take your time.
Using my oops. Try again.
Oh, perfect. I think we can see your screen from now.
Oh, you can? Great. Awesome.
Perfect.
Are we there?
Yes.
All right, great. So thanks for the introduction. So today I'm going to give you a little bit of background just about NASA, what we're doing currently, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Hopefully you're kind of keeping track. As Tony mentioned, I'm the director of the Neuroscience Laboratory. You could see from our logo, we're very much aligned with kind of what we're doing at NASA. We have this thematic Moon to Mars that I'll be describing at the beginning here. Then I'll talk a little bit about the research that we're doing in our lab. It's a applied research lab. But hopefully you'll find some things that kind of relate to what this collection of this group is about. And then we'll talk a little bit about some internship opportunities at the end. So hopefully you're familiar with the fact that we are going to the moon. And this is going to look a lot different than what we did the last time. The moon program is Artemis. We're planning to take a much more diverse cohort of people to the moon, and it's going to be a lot more involved. And one of the reasons it's going to be more involved is that what we're really standing up is an architecture that will help us prepare for success to go to Mars. So if we think about what we need to go for a Mars mission, a Mars exploration, the things that we're doing in our lunar program, the Artemis lunar program, are very intentionally designed to help us mimic what we'll need to go to Mars. So we know that's going to take a long duration transit in zero gravity to get to Mars. So we're planning on having a space station that's orbiting the moon called the Gateway, where we could send people to, and they could be in this microgravity exposure on Gateway before they descend to the lunar surface. So it's kind of mimicking this long duration microgravity transit that we'll have going to Mars. And you'll see why that's important from a neuro standpoint, because the longer you're in microgravity transit, the greater risk of things happening during the G transition to the Martian surface increases. We know we're going to have landers to get to the surface. So we're going to have, as we descend, with kind of landings that will have two different provide landers. SpaceX is providing a Starship, which is an enormous vehicle compared to what we put on the moon in the Apollo program. We'll have habitats and rovers and the like. But I want you to appreciate the fact that we are really kind of preparing for Mars intentionally through the lunar program. This is a kind of overview of our first couple of missions. If you've been tracking it, you know that we did complete our first uncrewed mission already. We have a crew selected, and they're actively training for the first mission with crew members, Artemis 2, and they're going to be doing basically a flyby, not landing on the surface, but we'll be learning a lot of information from that flight. And then our first human landing will be on Artemis 3. So we're a couple of years away from that. That right now is going to be using the SpaceX vehicle, Starship. And then the next one will be the space station, the lunar surface. So as we're kind of building this technology, will be that I'm going to be talking about. In fact, just in this last month, we got our review back for our first research proposal that's going to be looking at the crews on Artemis 3 through 5. So it's an exciting time to come and visit NASA and to kind of track what's going on here. So our job in the life sciences is to think about what we need to do to keep the crew healthy and safe throughout these missions. And as we've kind of looked at the different risk factors, we put these in really 5 different buckets of hazards. Of course, we know that as we go beyond the low Earth orbit, we're going to be exposed to higher radiation risk, and that definitely impacts some of the neurotech area that you guys are interested in. There's also some concerns about just the isolation and confinement, especially the distance from Earth as we plan these Mars transits. Right now, if something somebody had a medical condition, we can actually get them to the Earth's surface pretty rapidly, but that's not the case when we go for long transit. So we're going to have to really think carefully about what we plan and the medical kits, and be prepared to do different types of procedures without that ability to come back to Earth quickly. Our area that I'm going to be talking a lot about is altered gravity. So that's the thing that really impacts the nervous system, especially the sensory motor function that our lab deals with primarily. So we'll be talking about that. So those are some of the main hazards that we're looking at. So my lab is really focused on the sensory motor aspect. So, and this is something that we kind of take for granted when we make a movement or we try to orientate ourselves in our environment. We're really integrating a lot of information from our different sensors. So if I make a head movement to my shoulder, I have this flow of visual information. I have information from my inner ears that's detecting how I'm moving relative to gravity. I have all these pressure sensors in my muscles and skin and so forth. And all of that gets integrated in. And so when I get exposed to a novel environment like microgravity, the brain has to remap what those senses are telling you, because I'm getting some of these senses are very gravity dependent, like the otoliths in the inner ear, or some of the pressure sensors in the body and our the pressure, the tactile sensors in our feet. So the brain has to kind of remap all of that in order to be able to control movement. And so our lab is really looking at what risk does that pose when you go through that adaptation, and what do we need to do to develop countermeasures or things that we can improve performance, especially on these critical tasks like landing or egress or doing extravehicular activities. Now, the risk is always greatest when you're going through the gravity transition. So when you think about a trip to Mars, you're going to have several times when you're going to go through a gravity transition. You're going to have an adaptation when you get into microgravity, and then again when you get to the planetary surface, the Martian surface, or the lunar surface. You're going to have that microgravity transit also when you come back to Earth, and then again when you're into the Earth's gravity. And unfortunately, the risk is always greatest at these times, but this is also when you have these critical things like landing vehicles happening. So this is why this is a really important area. And also the brain, when it adapts to these new environments, it's often maladaptive for the next transition. So you learn how to move in microgravity very effectively. Well, that doesn't help you when you transition back to the Earth. You have to go through that readaptation all over again. So we think about how the sensory information gets integrated. It actually gets integrated in the brainstem and some nuclei called the vestibular nuclei. And there's a lot of brain pathways that stem from this, and it mediates different functions that these senses are really important for our motor control and orientation. And if you look at some of these pathways, you could predict some of the different outcomes that we might be interested in. So there's some vestibular autonomic interactions, and I'll be talking a little bit about motion sickness, which is a very common thing that we deal with in the space travel. There's some connections to the eye movement system, and so there's some gaze disturbances, connections to the cerebral cortex that deal with spatial orientation. So we have some disorientation and motion illusions. There's some connections to the limbic system, so we have spatial memory and navigation problems. And then finally, we have movements, fine motor movements that resembles cerebellar type problems, and then control of the spinal cord posture and gait. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this video. It's kind of an old video that done by a famous vestibular person that just illustrates how important some of these senses are to controlling our head trunk coordination. And you might think, well, this is mainly a visually induced or visually mediated type function, but if you wait for it a little bit, our friend Dr. Money here put some blinders on this owl, and you can see that his performance in keeping his head upright is still pretty remarkable. And so if you think about, if you just next time you're watching a sporting event or watching people that are having to put their bodies in different orientations, what you'll notice is we have a tendency to keep our head upright in this role playing. And that kind of helps some of our sensory process or visual processing. So thank you to the owl for illustrating that. So let me talk about space motion sickness. So this is a sickness that you get when you get into microgravity. Again, your brain is having to figure out why these senses are not telling me the same things. I'm no longer stimulating the otoliths, for example, when I tilt my head like I did on the Earth. We call it motion sickness because it's varied with spacecraft volume. So the early missions where there wasn't a lot of room to move, there wasn't a lot of space motion sickness reported, maybe just loss of appetite. But as we got into larger vehicles like the space shuttle, really the majority of crew members end up having to deal with space motion sickness. It is something that you get over in a few days. And if you've flown multiple times, like a lot of people did during the shuttle period, you tended to have less severe symptoms on your subsequent flights. So as I mentioned earlier, not only you get over that and your brain adapts to that microgravity environment, but that sometimes is maladaptive when you come back to Earth. And so we also experience terrestrial readaptation. Motion sickness is a term that we use for it. So you could kind of see this typical crew member sitting here after landing on a Soyuz rocket. And you might kind of look at him and you notice some things about him. Obviously, he's pale, suffering from kind of sickness, but you also notice he's looking way off to the side because you try to avoid making any head movement. So he's talking to someone by looking rather than turning his head. This graph here is showing motion sickness on a scale from 0 to 20. 20 is in the bag. 0 is feeling fine. And what you can see is there's a lot of variability. And these are just symptoms that are recorded when we're doing tests with different crew members. What's kind of interesting is we thought there would be a lot more sickness when we landed in the water, but that's the Dragon landings in blue compared to the land landings with the Soyuz in green. And it turns out it's really overwhelming. It's just the variability across people, not so much the vehicle. This variability is also evident when you watch people walking after space flight. So you can see this person on the right-hand side is ambulating pretty well on his own, and the other person's needing some help with a couple of people. So our crew members are assessed by flight surgeons as they recover, and we're trying to navigate getting them back to doing their activities of normal living. So the kind of exams they would go through, both for the shuttle and for station, are things that you might go through if you went to a neurologist and you had some kind of movement type disorder. So different things like looking at your eye movements and your ability to do kind of just the dexterity to touch your finger to your nose and so forth. I've kind of highlighted a couple because I'm going to show some of these from a research standpoint. But what you can see here is that after the space shuttle, that most of these symptoms were, on the mild side right after they landed. That's what R plus 0 means. It's recovery plus 0 time. And usually around day 3, they're recovered and there's very mild symptoms. So we started, as Tony said in the introduction, we've been using a computerized system. So instead of subjectively rating people, we're getting quantitative measurements of their postural sway with this computerized system that's shown here in the picture. So you can stand on this platform and we can measure your sway back and forth and give you a score, a stability score, where 100 is 0 sway, you're perfectly stable, and 0 would be you're unable to stand, you're falling down. And you can see the variability here. As I mentioned, this is shuttle data. So on day 3 is when we're normally returning crews to like driving and activities of daily living. And you can see on the more challenging condition here on the bottom where their eyes are closed and they're on an unstable support, for the most part, they're back to their pre-flight levels. But you can see up until that point, we've got some people that are on the kind of lower end of the spectrum. This is just standing upright, and it'd be like standing on foam with your eyes closed. But head movement sensitivity is a thing. So we sharpen this test by asking people to make head movements, just some plus or minus 20-degree head movements. And that really sharpens it. So this is now some station data. But what's interesting is to look at the shuttle short duration space flights versus the long duration ISS flights. And what you can see in green is this is showing the percent of crews, how many days it took them to recover to their pre-flight level. So that's what we're really tracking, is getting you back to what you did before you flew, before you went to space. And you can see in green, our short duration, people can recover within a few days. Again, that day 3 is about when most of them are going back to the activities of daily living, where if you've been in space for 6 months, it's going to take you more like a week before you can start doing some of those same things. So the transit time is important. That's why we're doing the Moon to Mars program. We want to understand, as you are in this microgravity transit for longer times, how it's going to impact your ability to do the surface activities that you need to do for exploration. Well, we can't take a big computerized system out to the landing. And so normally we pick them up in the field, whether they come down in a Soyuz like shown here, or now they're landing in the water with the SpaceX Dragon. And then we bring them back, and it usually takes about a day before we're doing our posture. So we really need to capture their performance soon after landing, because again, that's when they have to do these critical tests. What if you have to get out of the vehicle and do an emergency EVA right after you land? We need to really understand that. So it really drove us to do more field research. And so we can do some simple things. And actually, you see this person struggling to do a tandem walk. And this is actually a really challenging test. This is tandem walk, putting toe heel 10 steps. And this is a medical tent that we erect right outside. You can see it on the bottom right there, a medical tent that gets set up right outside where the vehicle lands for Soyuz. And for the SpaceX vehicles, we test them at a nearby airport. But what you can see is if you notice the video on the upper left, it stopped playing now, but this individual is doing this very, very well, and then really struggling just to put one foot in front of the other. They're not all this bad. This is one that's really striking. But what you can see here on the graph on the upper right is similar to what I showed with the posture. This is percent of people recovering, how many days it took them to get back to their pre-flight level. And what you can see is it was shown in different colors, some of the different tasks we asked people to do. So if it's a very simple task like this, getting up out of your chair, people can struggle with that right after landing. So that impacts, how we think about emergency egress and things like that. But if they have to do something more complicated that's really balancing, has a strong balance challenge like the one we're showing here, that's that chart on the far right there, and it's showing it's going to take people more than a week to recover. So it really causes us to think about what we can expect crews to do after these long duration transits to the Mars surface. So the other thing that we're looking at is landing and what we can do to, again, track their performance, but also what we can do to help mitigate and improve their performance. So we're standing up a lot of different landing simulators. If you come visit our lab at NASA, you can practice your hand at landing on the moon. We're setting these up in a lot of different motion environments. And so we're also just now starting an experiment where after crew members on ISS for 6 months, we'll bring them to our lab, and on a motion base, they'll have to land on the moon, and we'll be able to see how that microgravity exposure impacts their ability to do these kinds of manual tasks. We also look at training tools like onboard training. So on ISS, we have this nice platform for these laptops and hand controllers. And normally this is used to practice the telerobotics that they use with the Canadian Arm. We're going to actually have this landing simulation. So our subjects are going to be doing landings, moon landings on ISS, which will be kind of cool. And we also have a tablet test that they can practice just looking at the lunar landscape and deciding whether or not they need to deviate and go to an alternate landing site. These are the kinds of things that our crews are going to have to do when we go back to the lunar surface. We have done a limited amount of manual control type testing after ISS. So this is a driving test that we did. So your job is to just drive this car down a mountain road, and this is a simulation, and this is a playback of a crew member. On the left is this crew member doing it pre-flight, and on the right is that person doing it shortly after they got back to our lab, 24 hours after landing. And what you see in the graph is showing is they're spending a lot more time in the wrong lane as they're going down this mountain road. So it is a concern, how their ability to do that. And this is why we don't really let them do driving too soon after landing, because it just puts them in harm's way. And we've done some other things along at the same time, we looked at their changes in manual dexterity with the pegboard task and some dual tasking that I'll show, and just trying to look at this mapping of how much of this is a sensory kind of problem and being able to understand what motion you're exposed to versus other kind of cognitive effects. And this is a illustration of this cognitive effects that I'm talking about. If we give a crew member a single task to do, they might do a pretty good job. In fact, you can see here, comparison to pre-flight, there wasn't really any change in this joystick tracking task. And this is basically using a joystick to track an object that's changing direction and moving around a computer screen. So you can see there's a certain amount of error here, but nothing too remarkable early post-flight. But now if I give you something else to do while you're doing that, you have to monitor and then enter in some digits. You can see here we kind of reveal this underlying cognitive reserve problem that crew members experience post-flight. Also look at eye movement reflexes, and we see that the longer in spaceflight, the more likely you're going to have some decrements early post-flight. So this is just showing flight duration on the x-axis and the number of changes on the y-axis. So again, the longer the space transit, the more likely we're to see some changes when we go through those gravity transitions. We also do a lot of neuroimaging. A lot of this neuroimaging is associated with this redistribution of fluids. It causes some significant ocular problems. Excuse me. In our lab, we're also mapping how these changes in the white matter around the vestibular cortex map to changes in balance. And this is a graph that's just showing people that have the greater declines in white matter also have greater changes in their postural responses that I was showing you earlier. So this is some really interesting work that we're focused on right now. I've been talking about spaceflight data, and if you come to our lab, you might, and work in our lab, you might be able, or some of the other labs, you might be able to work with some crew members as they're coming back from space, but it's kind of rare and it's very expensive. So we have to look for different ground-based tools. So I'll be talking a little bit about some of these. We use one tool that we use that's sort of a neuromodulating type tool is galvanic vestibular stimulation. So I'll talk a little bit about that. We have VR and AR type applications to provide an analog for the spaceflight environment. Again, I've talked about motion bases. We also do some reduced loading. So some of probably, Tony, what your lab that you worked in dealt with this reduced offloading system that we have at JSC. We do parabolic flight, and that exposes us to brief periods of micro or partial G. And we're currently doing a head down bed rest study in Germany. And I already mentioned we're doing some neuroimaging work as well. So this is just some of the data from our partial gravity. So we're in this particular study, we didn't actually use lunar. We used it was a different objective here, but just looking at changes in time it takes to do an obstacle walk here. And I'm going to play a little video of somebody that's doing a jump. I'm not sure it's showing up very well. You can see it's a little bit different to walk in a close to lunar gravity environment. So it takes a little bit of adaptation and strategy to figure that out. We use motion bases, as I mentioned, and some of the motion bases we don't have at JSC. So this is one at Wright-Patterson base at the Air Force there that we're using. This is not a profile that we would actually put somebody in. This just shows you all the capability that this device has, but it does have this capability for extended centrifugation. So that's one of the reasons why we like this. And you can see that picture. So we can expose you to a period of time of centrifugation and take you through a G state transition. And then we can use that same device to put you into a landing simulation, and we can start looking at your performance after you've gone through a G state transition to landing on the moon. We can use this platform to look at things like, oh, we have an onboard trainer to help you. How does that improve your performance to deal with the disorientation from the G transition? We could also use this to look at what kinds of assessment tasks we need before you go do that EVA. And I'll show you some videos of that in just a minute. And because it has a lot of capabilities, we could even simulate the capsule wave motion when you come back. So we could really look at a lot of different flight phases with these motion devices. One of the things with this G transition, I'll just call your attention to the graph on the bottom right, is we've shown it has a high correlation. This is actually astronaut data, sickness in space flight, sickness on the centrifugation, and you can see there's a good correlation there. This is a device in San Antonio that's a little closer to us that we're using at Brooks, former Air Force Base. Now it's a Brooks City base. And this is just somebody that's going through this very kind of compressed assessment task where we're kind of stepping over things. This is something that we might do on a lunar surface, and not real striking, but you can see kind of the slowness of movement after having spent an hour in the centrifuge. And it's just those are the kind of simple tasks we're looking at that we might ask the crews to do, and just looking at how long it takes to do some simple tasks like that. So I mentioned earlier that we use some neuromodulation that we call galvanic vestibular stimulation. This is not a new technique. It's been around for really more than a century, but by providing electric current to the surface around your mass, just behind your inner ear, you can stimulate neural activity, and specifically activity of the end organs that detect motion back to the brainstem. And what you see here in this graph is showing, if you can see my mouse cursor, you can see this is actually neural activity when we're actually exposing people to real motion versus the galvanic stimulation, the virtual motion through that. And you can see there's a really nice correspondence over this frequency band here. We use this now clinically because we can show that if we use it in a subthreshold manner, so we use the principle of stochastic resonance, we could actually improve people that have balance impairment. We can improve their sway. But we at NASA are also looking at it to kind of cause disorientation. So as a training tool, so we can also go the other way. We can increase it and cause people to have worse balance. And so one of the things we've done is bring astronauts back that have gone through these G transitions and tried this out and said, how much of this duplicates what you experience on your space flight? And we not only use galvanic vestibular stimulation, but you can see this person's wearing some weights around their wrist and ankles and a weighted vest. So it's kind of simulating some of the heaviness that they experience as well. And we've got some really pretty remarkable results here. It's not, none of these analogs are perfect, but we're getting some really nice reports from the crew members that this is doing a reasonable job of simulating some of what they experienced. Back in the shuttle day, we also had some work done on this, and we looked at shuttle landings. And what you can see here is when we applied this technique, and that's the red bars, the landing performance, and this is just the different kind of parameters, like whether you crashed or your speed at touchdown and so forth. Your landing performance was impaired with this type of analog technique. So again, the crew member feedback is showing that we're getting some pretty good replication. And here's just some data where the analog is symboled A, and this is doing this kind of obstacle task. You can see it's not perfect. The astronaut data is labeled C, so we get more impairment, meaning it takes them longer to do this kind of task shortly after space flight, but it does impair kind of a healthy population. And the nice thing about it is you could turn it on and off, and you kind of instantly recover. So it allows us to train crew members what they might experience, but it also gives us an analog to test some of our assessment techniques. So just kind of wrapping up here, we are doing a number of research to kind of enhance performance. As we mentioned earlier, we're doing some things with manual landings like onboard training. We do have some folks that are doing some spatial orientation modeling so we could predict when you might get disoriented during a different landing approach, or trying to figure out what's the best display to provide the pilot to help improve their performance. We're thinking about different assessments that we can do before you go out the door and do your early EVA. That was a big part of our proposal we just submitted and is under review. We're thinking about things that you can do to improve their recovery through self-administered means. So if we can have you monitoring how you move your head and providing you some tools regarding that, we can enhance your recovery. Different kind of sensory augmentation. So this blue belt here is actually a vibrotactile belt that provides feedback about how you're moving. And then this video that was playing on the lower right is a tilt board that we're actually getting ready to test on ISS to help improve in-flight proprioceptive training. So we're providing a load and really targeting your ankle perception, your ability to kind of detect joint position in a way that our current exercise doesn't quite get us. We do have a pretty nice exercise suite of equipment on ISS. It has gotten better over time. It started with not having the most reliable and not giving us great loads. That posture data I was showing you earlier is also shown here on this graph. And what this graph shows in green, crew members that had access to the more advanced exercise are recovering quicker. And we actually have a study now that's going on where we're asking people to not use a treadmill because we don't think we're going to have a capability to have a treadmill on these exploration things. And we're trying to understand, what impact's that going to have in terms of the recovery once people go through these gravity transitions. So we've hopefully shown you enough data to show you that returning crew members are exhibiting some of these vestibular and cerebellar decrements. And this reflects some of the adaptive responses in these pathways that we were talking about earlier. So a lot of variability among crew members. It's also influenced by what we're asking them to do and what kind of countermeasures we offer. So we're always trying to optimize that. There's also a greater prevalence and severity of problems, symptoms when we increase the flight duration. So that's something we're trying to understand in our Moon to Mars architecture. The time course of recovery depends on, how complex the task is of just standing up versus doing something that has a postural challenge to it. And then finally, just coming up with some simple means of functional assessments can really help guide both the flight surgeons that are trying to determine when the crew is ready to do something, but also the crew members themselves. So usually before we do this posturography, we usually ask them to give their own assessment of where they think they're at. And then we measure it and we kind of show them, okay, this is what this test is showing you. So it's interesting. So that kind of concludes a description of what we do. I did want to spend a few minutes trying to encourage those of you that would consider internship at Johnson Space Center. So you could talk to Tony and he could describe his experience. Maybe some of you have also taken advantage of this. We do have a pretty nice program that is 10 weeks long at Johnson Space Center and at other space centers as well. The deadline is in the end of February timeframe. If you're interested, you can go to intern.nasa.gov and you can look at all the different types of student programs we have. If you're kind of targeting graduate school, there's some nice fellowships that you can obtain. So we've had a couple of PhD students in my lab that have, as part of their fellowship, they actually come and work in our lab as they're going through their own program. This typically starts, so I don't know this it's not official, but I expect that this program this summer will be June 2nd to August 8th, because it's usually the first week in June, and it goes for 10 weeks, you're assigned to one lab. So, you could be assigned to any number of labs. So Tony worked in a different lab than the one that I direct, but it's kind of a sister lab. So we do a lot of collaborative work together. But then you would get exposure to lectures and tours. So some of the interns I had last summer just made some collages of pictures of their work here. So this is some of the eye movement techniques that we use in our lab, some of that analog that I was showing you early, they're experiencing that galvanic vestibular stimulation with the weighted suit. You can see some of the operational tests that we use, like transferring weights across a kind of a mock lunar type surface. We have, AR, VR type things that they're exposed to. We have a really nice markerless motion capture system that we use for kinematics that you see pictured there. Some of the students got to go with us to San Antonio and do some of get exposed to what we were doing. Didn't get into centrifuge other than for pictures, but they got to see some of the work we're doing there firsthand. And then there's always a lot of, like I say, tours, opportunities. Here's a picture of the interns last summer with Nick Haig before he went. He's actually now in ISS, so it's kind of nice to see them with Shell, one of the crew members that had flown recently that's in our management. They actually had a great opportunity to do a lifetime event with Mike Barrett, who just came back from space, and they got to talk with him while he was in space and do kind of a Q&A with him and ask questions. So there's a lot of fun opportunities. So if you haven't really thought about it, I hope encourage you to consider it. And I think that's the end of what I wanted to share. So thanks for the opportunity, and thank you guys for taking time out of your studies to spend a little time together.
Thank you, Dr. Wood. That was a very interesting, stories about how the human space flight can relate it with the nervous systems. And yeah, I highly recommend to apply NASA internship because it's like one of my best memory in my school life. You can literally play volleyball with astronauts, with Johnny Kim and other peoples. And yeah, it's really fun. There's lots of activities you can do, and there's very cool peoples about researches and everything. So I would highly recommend it. Yeah, and I would like to go over a few questions that our students have asked about the researches. So the first question is, what research is being done to potentially reverse neural circuitry changes as a result of microgravities upon return to Earth?
So the kind of work that we're doing is very much trying to actively engage people. So we're not, this is the way we're kind of promoting this remapping, this change in neural circuits is just exposing you to environment. So a lot of it is, like I mentioned, that you have to be very careful about what you do. It is your brain is having to go through this adaptive change and kind of remap these senses are telling you differently than in the environment you were just at. And if I have to keep movement within a certain threshold. So if I don't do anything, if I just sit quietly, I'm not going to adapt to that new environment. I have to move in that new environment. But if I move too rapidly, it can really put me over an adversive threshold, and I could actually kind of reverse. So just how you move in this space is really important. And when crew members were coming back on the shuttle, they actually discovered this on their own. This is not guided through medical or research or anything like that. They just figured out, some of them figured out how they had to move, but they weren't really good at communicating it with each other. So I had one crew member that I was testing after his second flight, and he was in really bad shape. And I said, "So what did you do? What was your strategy?" I used to talk to them and kind of find out how they adapted or what was their strategy. And he said, "Well, I tried not to move at all." And I said, "I think that's why you're kind of struggling right now. Why did you do that?" And he goes, "Well, my first flight, I was told making head movements was good. So I made myself really sick making a lot of head movements." And I'm like, "So you've kind of illustrated for me these two extremes. So, and this is actually true in a lot of clinical pathology too, rehab. You have to kind of engage people in meaningful tasks to kind of bring about that remapping that changes in the neural circuit, but you've got to do it in a very smart and clever way. So we got to provide them the tools that they can do. Um, there has been a limited amount of work in space done on different kinds of countermeasures that we can do neurally. So most of what we're trying to do is get them to adapt to that microgravity environment. There has been research at different times and still ongoing about maybe exposing people to artificial gravity as a way of maintaining uh, their ability to kind of keep that motor program set for a gravity environment while you also can adapt to microgravity. So you could kind of have a dual adaptation, kind of like if you wear glasses, you could, at first when you get a new prescription, it takes you a while before you can, function with those new glasses for those of us that have that. But after a while, you could take them on and off, and your brain can just kind of change the gains of the reflexes pretty rapidly. So there's been some work looking at things like artificial gravity to kind of promote that conditioning, and that has some benefit of not just helping the sensory, but actually it causes some challenges to the sensory, but it might be very uh, good in promoting bone and muscle and cardiovascular health. So, but for the most part, the research in space has been really kind of promoting adaptation to that microgravity and then dealing with the problem when we go to the next gravity translation, trying to help them recover. So
Yeah, thanks for the answers. And next question is, I think it's quite interesting question. A lot of sci-fi depicts artificial gravity generated through centripetal force, like for the long-term space flight, like sci-fi movies. And is there
Mhm.
something your team and NASA are seriously considering making those augmented gravity for the future missions?
So we have this kind of strategy at NASA where we've privatized a lot of things, and we have some people that are looking at different space stations. So our space station that we have right now is gonna have to come down in about 2030. So it's sad. It's not going to be with us much longer. But we have some new providers that are coming up with some new space stations, and one of these is a company called VAST, and they are looking at having a space station that has an artificial gravity component. So there is some active work being done in that. We just completed a long-term bed rest study where we were looking at exposure to intermittent artificial gravity in Europe. And so we had people in deconditioned bed rest for 60 days, but once a day they would get out of bed, and some of them were controlled so they didn't get exposed to it, but others were exposed to 30 minutes of artificial gravity. And so we could look and see, okay, what is this improving? Because it's not always helping everything. It might be, helpful for one physiologic system and not for another. So there is some active research. There's some complication because when you're it's not like on the sci-fi movies. Like one of my favorite recent ones is The Martian, if you've seen that. And it's kind of cool how they just transition down to their lab setting when they're, exercising and so forth. But when you're moving in that rotating environment, you're exposed to Coriolis forces. So we have rotating devices in our lab because we do a lot of motion stuff. So when I spin at a high rate, I like to do things like point my hand out like this. And what you'll find is that the linear Coriolis will pull it off to the side. So it's not like moving in an artificial gravity environment is like moving in a static gravitational environment when you get to the planetary surface or you get back. It's like you're adapting to this weird rotating environment. And there was some studies done early in NASA where we had people living in these rotating environments for like 2 weeks. And very similar to adapting to space, it took them a couple of days to adapt, but then it also took them a couple of days to readapt to a non-rotating environment. So It's a challenging thing. It's not quite as simple as it looks like in the sci-fi movies, unfortunately, but it's worthy of consideration, and it may have some really important benefits because it deals with the holistic kind of countermeasure approach.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Seeing Dr. Sony White is also the one of the main figure doing some future space flight. And the other question, people are also curious about how do you break into this type of work? Is there any specific degrees or skills or are necessary for the being in the to pursue in this kind of field of research or being part of NASA?
That's a great question. So actually my bachelor's degree is in botany, which I'm not sure is even offered many places anymore. So I studied plants, and my goal was to kind of feed a hungry world with drought resistant grains. And somehow I got kind of bored with plants, although there's a lot of neat plant biology in space, but I just, got more interested in human physiology and things. So I have this kind of weird course. So, sometimes, it takes a different path. In our lab, we have engineers, we have physiologists, we have people with more medical degrees, we have psychology majors. So we actually have a very diverse set. And I think this is true kind of in many of the labs. We have nurses. So we have a variety of people. So you can take a lot of different paths. So my recommendation is just to kind of follow your passion and don't get too uptight that you're making the wrong decision, because you could be like me and go from botany to physiology. It's okay. Don't have to get it right the first time. It's just part of your journey.
So next question is, has NASA considered integrating robotics or AI-assisted movement systems to reduce the sensory motor strain?
Well, that's a great idea. Yeah, there has been some work, with different uh, robotics systems, and there's a lot of work being done, like in military, for example, to kind of help relieve that uh, stress if you're out kind of having to have a big heavy payload and things like that. We have a really challenging situation in our spacesuits. They're really challenging to wear. There's kind of this huge, you're basically in your own individual spacecraft when you're going on an EVA, and so they're large. A lot of the falls that were experienced in Apollo were not sensory; they were just because of the awkwardness of the suit. So there's a lot of work being done in suits. I can't say a lot of exoskeleton kind of applications are kind of implemented in those suits because they're challenging as they are, but there is some work being done. And so I think that's actually a really good strategy to kind of help with those sensory problems and kind of help reduce some of the workload. When crew members fall on EVAs, it looks like it could be even a little bit of fun, but it's very fatiguing. And so part of our job is to kind of make those efficient. One of the things we're going to do when we go back to the moon is we have a much higher tempo of EVAs. So we're really concerned about kind of doing the modeling so we can understand you as an individual, what kind of workload you can tolerate so that we can get you back to your spacecraft safely and kind of be efficient in these EVAs. So that's a great question, great strategy. There's a lot of work that you guys can take on, help us out with there.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. Are there any real-time monitoring tools to gauge an astronaut's adaptation progress to EVA microgravity environments?
So that's something that we're working on now. So I mentioned the markerless motion capture because these are very constrained environments. So we would love to be able to instrument crew members. And if you look at some of the research we're doing in analogs, it's kind of funny because they're just like instrumented all up. They might have like 4 or 5 things that they're on their wrist to monitor, you know, different activity. But usually it's challenging in spacesuits to do that kind of thing. But we look at different kind of monitoring tools when they go out on spacewalks. I mean, there's heart rate monitoring, There's heat stress monitoring. There's a lot of monitoring that's really critical to their safety. But in the cabin, it's pretty limited. So that's something that we're kind of working on. What do we need to do to monitor them, give them feedback? Everything also needs to be very self-administered so that it's done in a way that you may not be a specialist, a medical specialist, but you need to be able to understand yourself, how you're doing. We can give you guidance with this monitoring tool so that you know what you need to do to kind of position yourself for success. So it's an area of, that's actively being researched. Again, another great area for you guys to think about helping us with.
Great. So next question is about GVS stimulation. So we have heard that GVS could also mediate the sensory motor problems. At the same time, it has a potential to augment those kind of reality by giving a strong stimulation. So how precise is the GVS for, stimulating or to control the human nervous system?
So there are, we actually have a couple of grants that I'm monitoring that have been given to small businesses to do like multi-channel GVS that has been incorporated into virtual reality. So when people do virtual reality, we have to deal with cyber sickness because you have this sensory conflict between you get these visual stimuli and you don't have the corresponding actual motion stimuli. So those of you that do a lot of gaming, maybe you don't experience this, but maybe you've kind of experienced this in a virtual environment. And so people are looking at using GVS to provide that artificial vestibular stimulus to reduce that conflict. And they have shown that it helps mitigate motion sickness. So I would say it's fairly good if you need to just provide stimulation in like a single plane, but doing multi-axis type movements, it's something that is an area of active research where we've got a lot of people working in this system. And so we're learning more. I showed you some of the physiologic data in this presentation. So there's a lot to be learned, but we're learning a lot and it's getting more and more feasible.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's two more questions that's left. Uh, that's very interesting. What was the rationale behind the Prada spacesuit for Artemis 3?
Behind
The Artemis 3 mission, like a Prada spacesuit, like the luxury company Prada and the Artemis spacesuit have collaborated work to make a movie behind it. Yeah, what's the rationale behind it, or what do you think about it?
actually, I have no idea. Sorry.
I think that's a bit complicated, but and I think this will be the very last question. What is your recommendation in how we should apply to internship research program, and what is the application process and selection would like?
So for the fellowship program, is
Oh,
that what?
for internship, I think.
Oh, for internship. So yeah, get on the site early. The due date is not till February. So Tony, you could share maybe a little bit of what was successful for you. It's
Mhm.
good to kind of find out. If you get a chance to visit, and kind of meet some people. It doesn't hurt to have a connection where you could say, "Hey, I'd really like to work." If Tony convinced you that the lab he worked in was really good, and you kind of can say, "I'd really be interested in working in that same lab," that also kind of helps because it's like any job opening. There's some people that have to screen in a lot of applications, and it kind of helps them to know that, oh, okay, this is a good candidate for this lab. So if you express that ahead of time, that might be helpful. Um, yeah, so don't hesitate to kind of explore the website, kind of search for some of the different labs. It's not just in the life sciences, there's internships in engineering. And there's some colleagues of ours in engineering that are doing some really cool stuff that is probably mapped very nicely to some of the coursework that you guys have. And they're doing, they do their human kind of focus neurotech. So, you could find some really cool stuff at Johnson Space Center and find some good matches. We do have different kinds of internships too. We have these pathways internships. And actually those are more prevalent in the engineering communities because they take people and kind of repeat semesters. So it's kind of like a co-op type thing. But yeah, just get on that website and look around. If you are not finding what you need, kind of reach out to the contacts. You could also reach out to me and I'll try to point you in the right direction.
All right, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have from today. Thanks for all your effort and time for today's lecture. It was really great.
Okay, well, thanks for taking time out of the studies. Now you guys go, get back to school and don't forget to vote, right?
Yeah, thanks so much. It was very interesting. Yeah, I hope we can do some more collaboration with Longhorn Neurotech and Rice. And thanks for your time again.
All
See you.
right, you guys have a good evening.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye bye.